Hello, everyone, and welcome to California Wine Institute's Behind the Wines with our host, Elaine Chukan Brown. Thank you all for taking the time out to be with us today. For the month of July, the California Wine Institute's Behind the Wines series shifts gears to focus on California in a global context, bringing in thought leaders in wine from across disciplines to weigh in on the state of California wine on the world stage. The goal of these conversations is to lend perspective from the outside in, so that the international and domestic trade audience gain a more comprehensive view of the Golden State's wine industry, past, present, and future. Today we have the great privilege to welcome Eric Asimov. Before we get started, some housekeeping reminders for everyone. During the webinar, note that there are two communication methods available to participants that we encourage you to use: a chat section, as well as a Q&A section. These are different. The chat section is an informal way for you to communicate with other participants. Just be sure to select everyone in the to field, as it can default to panelists only. And then there's the Q&A section, and this is where we'd like you to submit your questions for Elaine and Eric to answer during the webinar. We will do our best to address your questions, but please know that any that are not answered live will be provided in a Q&A summary in the email that you'll receive following the program. Now I'd like to introduce our host, Elaine. In addition to writing for her own site, Waka Waka Wine Reviews, she serves as the American specialist for JancysRobinson.com and contributes to a long list of respected publications. She contributed to the 8th edition of the World Atlas of Wine, which has won multiple awards very recently, as well as the award-winning 4th edition of the Oxford Companion to Wine. She was named by the International Wine and Spirits Competition and Vinitaly as one of the world's top 5 wine communicators of the year for the last 2 years in a row. And Eric, chief wine critic of the New York Times and the author of How to Love Wine, a Memoir and Manifesto, and Wine with Food, Pairing Notes and Recipes from the New York Times. His weekly column appears in the food section of the Times. So now, Elaine, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, Eric. Thanks for being here.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's always good to see you, too.
Good to see you.
I feel like our, we signed on early just to make sure everything was ready and working with the technology. And I feel like anytime we get together, we're instantly talking about wine and geeking out about different parts of the world and different winemaking methods. And it's just always really fun to see you and speak with you.
Kind of an ongoing conversation over the years.
One of the things, about the work that you do, you really have a genuinely global perspective. You write about wines literally from all over the world. But one of the things that has impressed me about how you do your work too is that my impression is you really manage to keep up not just with the literal wine and production, but also with what's happening in the world of wine, these conversations that we're talking about. I see you regularly engaging in very small group conversations online, in this kind of new world of the pandemic, but also you've done an incredibly good job at doing things like finding blogs before anyone knew about them and participating in discussions on discussion boards and things like that. Could you speak just a little bit to how does that sort of perspective, engaging with the wine community itself, how does that inform the way you approach writing about wine for the newspaper?
Well, I think I have to approach it as a reporter, and that means talking to people all of the time. I think it's very tempting as a critic to think of oneself as omniscient and knowing all. And I'm happy to say that I've never been under that misimpression. There's a lot that I don't know, and the only way to learn is to talk to people, to try new wines, to listen to different voices, and I think it's it's helped give me different perspectives from my own, which is always important if you want to offer a complete picture.
Yeah. One of the things too, though, I know you and I are both inspired by the writer Gerald Asher, and something Gerald brought to wine writing through magazine format. He had much longer form options because he was writing for magazines. But the thing he did so well was really infuse writing about contemporary wine with a historical perspective. It was this like really grand, almost epic narrative. He was able to give this context to the wines that he was recommending and drinking through this really substantial historical way. And the thing that I see in your writing is, newspaper has shorter form in comparison to magazines, but I see you do that as well. Like there's a way in which you're always grounding what you're talking about in terms of what to drink now in that broader historical perspective. Could you speak to how does that sort of inform your work, and why does it matter to talk about history?
I think that comes naturally to me. I mean, I was trained academically as a historian, and I always think of things in terms of how they got that way. What was the context in which they developed? And I think that's especially important with wine, especially because for so long there's an influential school of thought in wine that divorces it from history, and asserts that all that matters is what's in the glass. And I've always resisted that notion. It does matter where a wine came from, how a wine developed, how a style developed, what it represents. I've always believed that good wine is an expression of culture. Mm-hmm. And if you want to understand the wine, you have to make at least an effort to look into the culture that produced it and see what the relationship is.
Well, and a part of why I asked you to kind of start there in the conversation is because that's really that perspective you just described, the history and the culture and like where did the wine come from, is really integral to my understanding of your selections of the wines today, and also your perspective of California wine. You've been with the New York Times since the mid 80s, writing about wine since the late 90s, and full time since 2004. Right. And in that, there's been such a remarkable shift in perspective and in culture and in production as well in California in that time period. But even just focusing on since 2004, there's been a really important transformation. And one of the ways, enormous, yeah. And one of the ways you've talked to me about that before is just the in terms of curiosity within producers themselves, where they were looking to for inspiration. Could you talk about what is the change that you've seen, and what do you think the crucial piece is there? Well,
I think to look at the modern California wine industry, you have to understand that it didn't develop solely from California. The modern giants, somebody like Robert Mondavi, were looking to Europe, and specifically to France, and in his case, to Bordeaux and Burgundy. And this was his benchmark for great wine. And California has always been in a dialogue of one form or another with Europe, whether it's immigrants in the 19th century planting grapes that reminded them of what they had back home. People like Mondavi wanting to compete with the greatest wines of Bordeaux and Burgundy. The sparkling wine industry that was influenced not just by Champagne, but very much by Germany. Mm-hmm. And there was a period in the 90s and 2000 when, in my opinion, people stopped this back and forth, this dialogue, and sort of assumed that everything they needed to know was right there in California. And there are producers, Pinot Noir producers, in the early part of this century whom I talked to, who started making Pinot Noir without ever having had a Burgundy. And, you know, on the one hand, it's laudable for producers in California not to want to imitate wines from other places. But on the other hand, you can't understand a Pinot Noir wine if you're refusing to try to understand Burgundy. And I think this kind of enforced ignorance is, you know, it comes from a lack of humility. And I think great wine comes from a place of humility.
Yeah, it's an interesting tension because there's this sense in which, you know, for any of us in the work that we do have to get past the period of imitation, you know, where the only way we understand how to do our work is to copy someone else's. And we have to gain that piece of confidence to know I have enough skill and knowledge to do the work as I understand it's important. But then you could become too entrenched in the confidence and fail to grow to the next stage, which is to see, no, I'm one among many in a community that's global. And so knowing the community is how I continue to refine my work.
You know, there's an insularity that comes from lack of access to the rest of the world. That's how wine was made largely for centuries. And even, you know, in the last 20 years, traveling to southern Italy in the early part of this century, and you might meet an Aglianico producer who had never had a Barolo, for example, not just a producer, but an enologist whose job was to advise myriad producers. And, you know, that's kind of understandable, and great strides in wine were made when people overcame that sort of insularity and reached out to the rest of the world. And it's not, you know, it's not just restricted to so-called backward places. Burgundy was one of the most insular places in wine in the middle of the 20th century, especially after World War II, when it wasn't a question of people not talking to the rest of the world. They wouldn't even talk to each other. But Burgundy has improved tremendously, you know, in the last 40 years. And one important reason for that, of many, is that they are now communicating with the rest of the world, doing stages in different parts of the world, bringing what they've learned in California and Oregon and in New Zealand back to Burgundy and vice versa. And it was kind of shocking to me to find people in California, you know, within the last 20 years who weren't interested in what was going on in the rest of the world. And I think it showed up in their wines.
Right. Yeah, there's a weird way in which I feel like you can taste when a producer doesn't taste other people's wines. There's something sort of staid about the wine. It doesn't have the same kind of dynamic character to it often. And that's not even I think in the last 10 years, there's been so much conversation around the idea of ripeness as if that's the pivotal piece. But I actually think even across a range of styles or ripeness levels, there's a way in which you can tell if a person's aware of global wine. There's a kind of dynamic element to the wine that shows up. But here, specifically looking at California, I think there's been a massive increase in change around this very issue. There's been so much, there's a way in which, as you said, California was founded on an international perspective, and that really dynamic, innovative approach inspired by other regions of the world. And then it sort of went into a lull period around that. But with newer producers, there's been a huge increase in going to do harvest, not only in Europe, but actually other parts of the New World across the Southern Hemisphere, yes, especially. And then also, I mean, one of the great advantages of being in the United States is, alongside the UK, the US and the UK have the greatest influx of wine genuinely from all over the world. So we have this great advantage of really having that global tasting experience as well. But could you speak to, how has that change shown up? You're there in New York and have access to, one of the greatest retail and restaurant markets in the world for wine. And I know you've really seen that shift in perspective, that global perspective coming back. Could you speak to how does that show up for you now?
Well, I see it in California, sort of contemporaneously with people who've taken an insular approach. You have other people who have looked to the rest of the world, who are genuine wine lovers, curious and inquisitive, and drinking and traveling, drinking wines from all over. And the so-called New California movement, I think, is inspired to a great degree by this curiosity and this tasting of wines that come from all over, and that have been only available really in the last 20 to 25 years. It used to be, to cite one example that we'll talk about today, the Jura. 20 years ago, hardly any American had ever heard of wines from the Jura. Even the French in Paris didn't know the Jura. It was kind of this, this land unto itself. I once called it the Australia of France, because it in such isolation, it had developed styles and grapes that were seen nowhere else, really. And those wines have become, astonishingly very popular in the first 20 years of this century, and they were inspiring to a number of California producers, just as many other sorts of wines that had not been widely available before are now you're seeing people growing grapes in California, like Assyrtiko and Caricante and Frappato, and I'm sure there are many other different grapes that people are experimenting with just because they've tried these wines and really enjoyed them.
Well, and one of the other important shifts that happened from the very beginning of this century, so in California, 1997, I think, becomes this like really pivotal year in that there is a massive diversity of plantings across the state, and especially in the North Coast. But we unfortunately had used a rootstock that was vulnerable to phylloxera. So this great replanting occurs. And 1997 actually is the first year that regions of California become dominated by single varieties. Mm-hmm. So 97 is actually, it's a pivotal year because it's the first time that Cabernet Sauvignon literally becomes the predominant variety in Napa Valley. Everybody associates Cabernet with Napa, but actually until 97, it was not the most planted variety, which is really interesting to me. But one of the varieties that I think we've forgotten used to play a really significant role here in California and especially in Napa Valley was actually Shannon Blanc.
Yes.
And one of the things that I think is also connected to this conversation we're having, as producers have come back in the last, 15 years or so to really being inspired by that global trend, it's at the same time paralleled an inspiration from old California, older California. And so the first one you picked is actually Sandland Shannon. And it's such a great example of, Tegan Pasalacqua, absolutely inspired by global wine. He's connected to producers all over the world. He's done harvest stage all over the world, New Zealand, South Africa, France. He's spoken in Italy at wine conferences, spent a lot of time in Spain, of course, all over the United States. And in a lot of ways, I think knows California vineyards better than almost anyone. But he's making this Chenin. Could you speak to us about, why Sandlands and why Chenin in this conversation?
Yeah, well, Shannon Blanc to me is the perfect example of a grape that was very popular in California. It was widely used for what we used to call jug wines. And it was grown quite a bit in Napa Valley. The Charles Krug winery, Peter Mondavi's winery, made a lot of Chenin Blanc, but it was done in kind of a semi-sweet way, and I don't think it was ever really taken seriously. It was it was made in mass and meant to sell fast and drink fast. And when California started to evolve in a more ambitious way, a lot of Chenin in Napa Valley was pulled out. It was kind of dismissed as a serious grape. And it wasn't really until the 21st century that people started to re-examine it. And partly that is the new interest in the Chenin Blanc wines of the Loire Valley, spurred more than a little bit by the sommelier Pascaline Pelletier. And these wines are so good and so interesting that it caused California, young California wine producers to rethink Chenin Blanc. And old vines have been discovered in different vineyards in Santa Barbara County. It's been replanted a little bit in Napa. Old vines have been found in places like Lodi, Kershima. Tegan has prospected old vine Chenin Blanc.
Well, and Sierra foothills too. There's some older vines there as well. Yeah.
Contra Costa County, and now, rather than just sort of making a cheap and cheerful kind of wine, people are really trying to see what can be done with Chenin Blanc in California, planted in the right kind of place, made farmed conscientiously and made with care. And I happen to love all of the Sandlands wines. I buy them every year, and I'm fascinated to see which old grapes Tegan finds. He's done Mataro, otherwise known as Mourvèdre, Syrah, Carignan. I don't recall whether he's done a Cinsault or not.
Yes, from Bechtold. The oldest vineyard, Cinsault vineyard in the world is in Lodi.
Yeah.
And Tegan works with it for Turley, of course, but also for Sandlands.
Yeah. These are all grapes that are part of California history. They're part of the mixed black vineyards from all over, and to sort of re-explore them as varietal wines is really fascinating to me.
Well, and so one of the other lesser known pieces of California history, BV made sparkling wine. They're of course known for their Cabernet historically. They also historically were known for Chardonnay, but they also made sparkling wine entirely from Chenin. This is during Tchelistcheff years, and so the Chenin was planted along the valley floor and in the mountains later in Napa Valley. But by the time Chenin started kind of getting a resurgence in California, really there was very, very little of it that anyone knew about. And Jurassic Park down in Santa Barbara, as you mentioned, became this sort of resurgence. And today most Chenin, historically though it was made in these other styles, today most Chenin coming out of California, it's sort of small lot, dry Chenin.
Yes. Yeah. Leo Steen is another producer, but Tegan's Shannon is really superb. I think he gets all of the things that I love about Shannon Blanc. I see in his wines. It's got the richness of texture without heaviness. It's got that floral kind of chamomile quality and slightly honeyed element, and it's really a nice wine.
Well, and it says a lot too. He actually makes multiple Shannons now.
Yes.
And has from as many as 3 regions: the Sierra Foothills, Amador, this one that we're talking about from Lodi, and then he's not making it now because the vineyard was pulled, but he made a Napa Valley Chenin for a while, and of course a California Chenin, a sort of blend from regions. And it's actually quite remarkable to have the opportunity to taste them side by side, because there really is regional character that differs quite significantly between them too. It's a variety that is really quite regionally expressive and also ages incredibly well, you know.
Yeah, and I think there was kind of a small, I don't want to call it an explosion, but maybe just a small burst of Chenin production in the last 10 years, and I'd like to see it continue to grow. I think it's just a great and interesting grape, and it has a lot to say.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, it's so distinctive.
Yeah.
Well, so one of the, just keeping track of time here as well, one of the other wines that you selected are not Roberts. Going back to the Jura conversation, we have, you selected the Trousseau. And it's such an interesting example to me to talk about in terms of where California is now. Because when they started, they really were focused on Syrah. They're still focused on Syrah. And they kind of, are not Roberts became known because of their Syrah. And then about 10 years ago, they got this wild hair, this idea to try making Trousseau, inspired by wines of the Jura. But I see this wine, the Arnott Roberts Trousseau, as really one of the game changers for California today. And you wrote about it relatively early on. Can you speak to, like, how do you see the role of this wine in California's current history?
Well, nobody was making a Trousseau wine in California, and Arnott Roberts wanted to, because they had been inspired by the Jura, and they tried to find Trousseau in California and couldn't, until they did what I would have done to start with and just Google it, and they found the Luxinger Vineyard in Lake County that had planted, they had planted Bastardo, which is what Trousseau is called in Portugal. Mm-hmm. And it's used there for port and Madeira. It's kind of a minor player in those wines. And the Luxingers had an idea that maybe planting it would inspire somebody to make fortified wines in California. But they ended up selling it to Duncan and Nathan, and they made this wine. I guess the first vintage was around 10 years ago or so, maybe a little more. And it just so happened that several other winemakers had been interested in making Trousseau. Tegan Pasalacqua has made it. He got the Bohan Ranch vineyard to graft over some Merlot, I think it was, to Trousseau. And there were a few other plantings. I believe Wells Guthrie planted some Trousseau. Jason Lett in the Willamette Valley. And I just think it's a fascinating wine. And Tegan has found Trousseau in many of those old California vineyards as well, interplanted with Zinfandel and Carignan and the rest. So it does have a lineage that goes back to the earliest winemaking in California. And what I really like about this wine is the kind of, it's made in a very bright, fresh way. It's, it kind of epitomizes the term crunchy. If you've ever heard of wine called crunchy, it's this wine. And, this was sort of exhibit A in, the culture wars that were going on in the earlier part of the century, when Parker railed about godforsaken grapes like Trousseau, which he said had been tried and rejected and, sent to the scrap heap of history. And now a bunch of Eurocentric people were trying to resurrect them and making their unripe wines. And this is a wine that I think it's 12 point something percent alcohol. And it's just, I find it absolutely delicious. There's nothing unripe about this wine. It's just a different style. And there's the term ripeness is kind of it's a moving target. There's a lot of ways to achieve ripeness, and it's not just leaving it in a vineyard to become rich with sugar.
Well, and to kind of pull out something that you were just kind of mentioning, this wine is such an example of rediscovering California's own history. The inspiration came from looking at wines of the world and seeing Jura as an interesting option to inspire California. But as you mentioned, actually these Portuguese varieties or Galician varieties actually were here already. And, they've been here actually for quite a long time. They were brought over, by the Spanish missionaries in the 1800s. But at the same time, there was a real boom for them in the 90s because there was interest in, a lot of growers expected a port boom, a California port boom. And so a lot of these varieties were planted then, as you mentioned. So Arnott Roberts, inspired by Jura, kind of rediscovered something of California's past, but also took what was already here in California, not being thought about, and said, wait, we can see this in a new way. And I feel like this wine becomes a pivot point. It represents a pivot point in California when it really kind of opened the door. It inspired a big planting of Trousseau itself. I mean, not a big, it's, still not huge volumes, but, producers across the West Coast suddenly thought, oh my God, let's plant Trousseau too. And yet it also, I think, represents a moment when people realized, wait, let's look for unexpected regions, but also unexpected varieties.
Yeah, and Arnott Roberts is interesting because they were among the first of a new wave of California producers who were not either born to the land, they didn't come up owning great swaths of land, nor did they make a fortune in another business so that they could afford to buy land. You see this a lot now. People who can't afford to buy land in high status areas, but they can prospect for grapes. Make arrangements with farmers who have been growing grapes, maybe even influencing their methods of farming, their viticulture, and they can buy all sorts of grapes. Effectively, they're negociant, but they're also taking part in influencing the farming. And what makes somebody like Arnott Roberts, very distinctely Californian, aside from the fact that they grew up in Napa Valley and were immersed in the wine industry in one way or another from childhood, they're making all sorts of different wines, whether it's Trousseau or Chardonnay, Syrah, Cabernet. They may be making a Pinot Noir this year. Making a rosé of Touriga Nacional. They've made Gamay. This is not a European method. If you're from Europe, you're usually geographically centered, unless you're a big corporation, and you make one, or you make whatever the wines of the region are. You may make them from a lot of different vineyards, but you're not doing this sort of marketplace of wines, and that's a very traditional California kind of thing. Mondavi, how many different wines in their earliest days they made Cabernet, Chardonnay, of course, but they might have made a bunch of different. They might have made a Zinfandel or Petite Syrah, a Merlot. That was the style of California winemaking. You decided yourself for entrepreneurial reasons what to make, rather than because of traditions of your locality.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. I think it can be easy. Sometimes I think American culture is often so focused on what's new that there's a weird way in which we forget to think historically, and somehow that pops out into us forgetting what's a big deal now wasn't a big deal before, and sometimes even last year. We kind of lose the historical context around what we see as normal sometimes. Yeah. And really the idea that Cabernet, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir being standards, that's actually relatively new, historically speaking. And the thing I love about these kinds of wines that we're talking about is it's this reminder that we're still getting to know what's possible in California. This is like a new form of innovation in terms of our thinking about California and what's possible. But at the same time, this new thinking in terms of places and varieties actually comes back and reinforms what we take for granted with the established varieties too. And I think we see that with this third wine that you've selected, Brock Cellars Vine Star Zinfandel. Yep. Zinfandel is like iconic, classic California variety, but we see this same kind of look to the world and look to our own history influence coming out in this third wine as well.
This is a fascinating wine for me because Zinfandel has been through many stylistic evolutions.
Yeah.
We've had Zinfandel bordering on port. We've had wines that were a little bit more before my time in the 70s that were later reviled as food wines because they were somewhat low in alcohol and considered, I don't know. I've never actually had one of those wines, but it's such a historic grape, and its status has risen and fallen. And right now, if you go, well, you can't go to a New York restaurant right now, but it's kind of hard to find a Zinfandel, even in some wine shops. And I cut my teeth drinking Zinfandel in the 80s. And that was a period before they became 16% monsters. And you could taste the fruit, but there was a balance and a crispness to those wines. And when I first tasted Brock's Zinfandel, less than 13% alcohol, with that really kind of woodsy, old-fashioned, spicy flavor, but never descending into jamminess. I got really interested in Zinfandel again, and I think there are more producers who are aiming for a different style to Zinfandel, just experimenting with it and seeing what you can do, not by harvesting grapes that are unripe, not by playing around with it in the winery, but just seeing what's available. And these are wines that maybe are influenced by Beaujolais or the Northern Rhone Valley, or even Pinot Noir.
Well, and that's one of the things that I think is so interesting about the work that Chris Brockway with Brock Cellars does. He overtly describes this Vine Star Zinfandel as inspired by Beaujolais and Rhone. And I think in a New World context, we have a habit of thinking varietally and sort of lock in our perspective on, you know, what a Pinot can be in by thinking only in terms of other Pinots. But
Right.
this sort of movement of expanding perspective actually is reflected too in something like this Zinfandel, where, you know, I take it Chris is inspired, again, as you mentioned, Beaujolais and Rhone, but with Zinfandel, which is in itself fascinating. But he's also really inspired by old California, like very old California.
Yeah, I mean, his his initial inspiration, he once told me, was from the Zinfandels his father used to drink, which, you know, were really on that that had that balance, that good acidity, yet that what they used to call briary kind of expression, woodsy, herbal, and not just jammy. And I'm not saying that those are, you know, the higher octane Zinfandels are all bad. Turley makes some of the purest Zinfandels around. Although I have to say, I am somebody that looks at the number. I am concerned with alcohol content, and, you know, I like to drink a lot of wine, and once you get up to 15.5 and 6%, you're cutting into my ration. So
one of the things too that kind of we're not speaking about directly, so I might ask us to briefly, is just, you know, cost too. You know, when we're talking about these unexpected regions, unexpected varieties, it often becomes easier for producers to make more affordable wines as well. And I think it's one of the challenges of California wine moving into international markets is as soon as you add taxes and tariffs and things like that, the prices go up. You know, so can you speak to that side of these wines and the conversation we're having?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge not just in the international market. It's in, you know, across the United States. California has always had difficulty making the really good, honest $20 wine, and it doesn't compete with European wines in that realm very easily. And even these wines that we've chosen, they're not exactly inexpensive, and that's more of a supply and demand issue. I think these producers have become quite popular, and people want to drink their wines, and so they are willing to pay a little bit more money. You know, one of the reasons I've always thought that California has had difficulty at that price is because so many of these less expensive wines are knockoffs of popular, more expensive styles. So that if Napa Cabernet and Sonoma Chardonnay are going to get really high points and are considered, you know, the epitome of what California does, wine companies are going to grow a lot of Cabernet and Chardonnay in the Central Valley and you know, manipulate and process the wines to mimic more expensive styles. And it doesn't fool anybody, but it works because, you know, people will pick up those wines in a supermarket. And it's a little bit of a disadvantage to Europe, where so many of these local wines that nobody ever heard of and are made from grapes that are unknown, from places that are have not achieved high status, are sold in this country, tariffs notwithstanding,
Right.
for fairly reasonable prices. So you know, it's easier to get in a $20 Irulegi wine, you know, made from Tannat and Cabernet Franc, that is an honest expression of a place, than it than the equivalently priced California wine, which is often a processed bottle.
Well, and so, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point because the producers, or rather consumers, need to be really curious to go for these lesser known wine names that come from some other regions or some unknown varieties. But as wines like the three that we're looking at today become established and known, at least by wine geeks and, you know, that level of wine lover, it sort of opens the door for a slightly more planted area for these varieties, and so then also slightly more production, which then helps oftentimes prices go down. You know, as another example, I mean, I think, you know, we talked briefly with Zinfandel in terms of how people are rethinking. Each of these wines really is an example of rethinking a variety that's actually part of California's history, but seeing we can make it in a new way. And another example of that is I see people right now rethinking Petite Syrah. And so, you know, Mountain Tides is a newer label that's come out recently, and it's devoted entirely to Petite Syrah, investigating how to make it from different regions in a fresher, more aromatic style. But once they got established and were able to get enough vineyards, access to enough vineyards, they've been able to use that slightly higher volume, still relatively small, to make a $20 California Petite Syrah. You know, so that's the thing too, is if we support these smaller production wines, their production can increase enough that they can make those less expensive options too.
Yeah, Lioco is another example. They make some very good single vineyard Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, but they were making an inexpensive blend, I think dominated by Carignan, which they called Sativa and Indica. But just, you know, a really nice wine to inexpensive wine that was really good with food. And I would love to see more wines like that.
Yes. Well, so one of the other things too that we have to address in speaking with you is, you know, I think coming from a California perspective, a lot of producers here are totally confounded by the New York market. And so I am obligated to ask you about that at least briefly. But before we get into that, one of the other things that you and I have spoken about is how globally influenced the restaurant side of the wine trade is as well, and how, you know, Kelly White and Scott Brenner, they founded Press Restaurants wine program and made the choice to be devoted entirely to Napa Valley, but really deep cellar historical Napa Valley. And you've commented on how you feel that actually really importantly changed public perception of California wine. So even though it's a restaurant environment sold only in California, you've talked with me about how that choice that they made here in California actually changed public perception, certainly nationally, but also globally, on what California wine amounts to.
Yeah, and you know, I guess I'm talking about the sommelier culture, which is so influential in New York, restaurants naturally. And, you know, there was a period of time when it was hard to find California wines outside of steakhouses because of the perception that they would all adhere to the overpowering style. And Kelly and Scott's wine list, in which they went deep into the history of Napa Valley, I think really demonstrated how good these wines could be, gave a historical perspective to them, widened the story from just a kind of points-chasing trophy wine saga, and influenced sommeliers in New York to want to dig deeper into the history of California. And in doing that, I think they were able to see that California was a more diverse place than a lot of people had thought.
Well, and my impression too is that here in California, it changed the culture as well, and that a lot of other, winemakers were going there in order to taste older wines. They would have wines by the glass where they'd open a magnum of an older bottle, and so you could kind of go in and have a great surprise, and Kelly and Scott were also so good about learning what you enjoy and then presenting surprise options along the way too.
It's, as you were saying before, there's a kind of an ahistorical American attitude that prizes what's new and sort of ignores what's proven itself over time. And you saw that with just the arrival of producers who would plant a vineyard and ask hundreds of dollars for the first vintage.
Yeah.
And people would gladly pay it because there was so much hype, but they were ignoring producers who had been making great wine for years and maybe hadn't changed their styles to they weren't following trends. And I think that it's wonderful that these producers are once again being recognized for, like somebody like Kathy Corson, who, is a Napa Valley treasure. And, a lot of people didn't realize she was been doing it all this time.
Well, and, you actually, as a wine writer, have made a point of celebrating these kind of stalwart producers, Kathy Corson, Hansel, Stony Hill, certainly as examples. But, Mount Eden, Maya Kamis, they've gone through some change, but, still really historically iconic. And, but how do you resolve that tension? As a person having to kind of keep up and keep readers for a newspaper environment, how do you kind of write about these iconic historical producers of California, but keep it fresh for readership? How do you resolve that tension?
Well, I think it is fresh. The fact that these producers have been there and were so often dismissed as old-fashioned or not keeping up with, modern styles. And I'm looking for stories. And to me, those were not only great wines, but great stories with a history to them. I don't think it's not such an interesting story when all you have to say is, they're viticulturalist and they're is Parker approved, and their wine consultant and their winemaker also makes cult wine. I don't know. That there's no there. There has to be some kind of practice over time. And I don't mean practice in the 10,000 hours sense, but achievement over time. And, wine is not something that develops overnight. You only get one harvest per year, and it takes many harvests to get to know a place, to get to know your own capabilities, how a wine can best be made. And I think that we have to really pay more respect to the people who have been doing it. And that's another thing we can take from the old world. And I think we're learning that.
Mm-hmm. Another big tension for writers, I think, too, that maybe you can speak to is the tension of these exciting, smaller exploratory projects and then wines that are actually available. So how do you approach that kind of tension?
That's the thorniest problem I generally face because, as we all know, the wine distribution system in the U.S. is completely broken. And, if I'm writing for a national audience, not to mention a global audience, it's virtually impossible for me to be able to ensure that the wines I write about are going to be available everywhere. But my rationalization has been that we read theater reviews of plays that are opening in London. We read in New York. We read restaurant reviews from Los Angeles and Paris and Peking or Beijing or we read these because we're curious and we want to know what people are doing, and we want to know what we want to see achievements. And I don't think that we need to have the expectation always of immediately being able to find a wine that's mentioned. I think we ought to be curious about what's available and what people are doing, and keep it in the back of our mind, because we might find it next year, or once we're able to travel again, we might see it on a restaurant wine list, or, in another place. And, I don't know why in wine there's always the expectation that of immediate availability. We'd like that to be true, but it's not always, and maybe that's okay.
Well, it's such a great, I feel like part of what's implicit in the point you're making goes back to what you said earlier, that you're not just writing about what's literally in the bottle. And I think one of the things that goes alongside that period of time that we started the conversation in, talking about this period of influence where producers were only looking at their own work, so to speak, or and not looking globally, that parallels the same moment in time around wine writing that was being dominated by looking only at what was literally in that glass, and in a way, or that bottle rather, and in a way removing it from the global context. The two things kind of were happening together. And but what you're really talking about, and what I see in your writing and what you just described, is this way of seeing wine as a cultural piece, as an expression of cultural, as an expression of perspective, and expression of thinking. And so if you're looking at wine and the story that comes with it, you're not just saying this wine is good, you're also saying, and it gives us something to think about and reflect on. And so you might not need to have the exact wine if you're still also looking at the culture of thinking that's connected to it.
Yeah, and I think there's just an expectation in this country that everything should always be available at all times. Yeah. And I don't think the world necessarily works like that. Nor should it. And it's good to. I'm interested in all kinds of things that I don't have immediate access to, but I would like to learn about, and I find meaning in this learning. Yeah, so I think wine represents, aside from being a consumer product, it's most definitely that, and a beverage, a refreshing beverage. But there's kind of a scale of what wine is and what it can be. It's something delicious to share with friends. It's also something that can be interesting and complex and expressive of a people and a place. It's also something that can be profound and take us to places in our own mind and body that we hadn't expected to go. And there's we can accept wine in all of its different expressions and not only think of it as one thing.
Well, and so we're almost out of time, but so as one last question, we've been talking about ways that producers in California have been influenced by California's own history, and also by looking at wine globally. And we talked about how the choice that Kelly and Scott made at Press to really commit to history of California actually changed the way other, people in other parts of the country and the world thought about California and what's possible here. But now going the other direction, just as one last comment, can you comment on how you see California influencing either other producers or other parts of the world, whether here on the West Coast, the country, or the world?
Well, certainly people in Europe who have spent time in California or in other places in the U.S. Always find this to be a really fruitful experience. One of the benefits of having this kind of entrepreneurial culture that's guided the American wine industry is the freedom to do anything you want, which, in Europe in particular is something that is, shocking, because they're so bound by appellation rules and traditions and so on that, you don't have a lot of room for personal expression. And I think that a lot of Europeans find this to be not only refreshing, but inspiring, and gives them ideas of ways that they can do things that even within the very rigid rules of wherever they work are more expressive, more liberating, and often better for the wines that they want to produce. And I've had a number of people in Europe tell me that. And of course, there are quite a few European winemakers who are also working in California, for example, and find this to be remarkably inspiring for them, because if you come from a place like Burgundy, for example, where all of the great vineyards have been identified, the great terroirs, and you're merely a caretaker. I shouldn't say merely, because there's a lot of responsibility that goes with that, but you're not discovering something for yourself necessarily in a way that you might be coming to the Santa Rita Hills, for example, and finding a piece of land that hasn't been planted, and identifying that in your mind as having the potential of a great terroir. And, having that experience that a lot of Californians have had is something new for a lot of Europeans, and something that's really fulfilling.
Well, and with people I've spoken to in Europe, it's maybe they can't rethink what's planted or what the appellation defines, but what I've seen is this recognition and seeing how much innovation and exploration defines California winemaking. They suddenly start to see, wait, the way I was taught to make wine isn't static. I can explore that, or and so they start to see where they can explore within the bounds that they do have, which is again that the thinking in terms of wine as a part of culture and wine as a reflection of perspective and thinking, not just wine in the bottle.
Yeah, the more give and take that you have, the better. You don't have to repeat everything that you see or learn.
Yeah.
But it opens so many doors to communicate.
Yeah. Well, we are out of time, but I thank you so much for being with us today and making so much time. And I always enjoy these conversations with you, but it's really, it's quite special to be able to share the conversation, and the chat window. People have been so excited to see everything that we're discussing and that you have to share and your insight and perspective. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Elaine. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Eric. To all of our attendees, a recording of today's webinar will be published to the California Wine Institute's YouTube channel in the next couple of days, and all participants will receive an email with that link, so keep an eye out. And we hope that you will join us next week as we continue this chapter of Behind the Wines with wine writer Jamie Good. He'll be broadcasting from London with Elaine here in California on Tuesday, July 21st at 10 a.m. Pacific. Thank you again.